I reached out to you because I was very, very curious because folks are writing a lot about Donald Trump and malignant narcissism and his mental health, but we're not hearing a lot about his most diehard supporters. And I was just wondering, what is your take on this political moment?
I think we are in a period of time where I feel like Donald Trump fits the stereotypical profile of a cult leader. And many of the followers, especially the ones that say, oh, he could do anything and we would still believe him and we would still follow him. It just feels like people have been entranced or bewitched or indoctrinated into a totalistic mindset. And these strategies of fear, programming, and redefining reality and denying reality and calling all independent journalism fake news if it doesn't agree with him. I feel like we're on the verge of a totalitarian takeover of our democracy. And that said, there are institutions, including Bob Mueller's investigation, not to mention the FBI and the CIA and other law enforcement people and other countries and their intelligence services that can see what everyone can see, which is a consistent pattern of unethical, untrustworthy, pathological lying, and Russian involvement to the demise of America's prestige and power and influence around the world. That said, my fear at the moment that he was sworn in was that when the rubber hit the road and he was in danger of losing power, that he would invent a terrorist attack or do something and then declare martial law. That's still my fear.
Why do you think there are so many folks, even in the mainstream media, folks who should know better, who are so resistant to your intuitions and observations about Trump and political cultism?
Well, the big picture for me, having been an activist for 41 years after my own deprogramming out of the moon cult, is that people are still operating with what social psychology calls the fundamental attribution error, which says that when people try to understand other people, they have an overwhelming tendency to blame the person or to over-personify the situation and under-evaluate the social environmental influences. And to this day, people, at least in the media and especially in fiction media, there's lots of interest in cults and mind control. But in the real world, people think it could never happen to me. Only weak, stupid, uneducated people could fall for that. When in fact, everybody is vulnerable. And once one engages in a set of behaviors, even something as singular as voting for someone, the tendency is to want to have confirmation bias that you make the right decision and you systematically ignore countering information that challenges that bias. And it really requires, to a certain extent, a level of development, to use psychological terms, stage development, where you can hold multi-paradigms at the same time and see the big picture and understand that things are not binaries and they're not black and white, all or nothing, good or evil, but that there are facts that can have multiple interpretations to a certain extent. But push comes to shove, there really is the scientific method and there really are facts that are true.
How do we separate or understand the difference between enthusiastic support for a political leader versus a cult-like appeal for a political leader? So, of course, people who supported Obama and other politicians were remarkably enthusiastic for a variety of reasons, but Obama didn't have that sort of cult-like Svengali hold over his supporters. So how, in terms of definitions, do we define or separate enthusiasm or an enthusiastic group from the attributes of a cult or a cult leader?
So let me just say that I look at reality in terms of a spectrum or a continuum of influence, of ethical influence to unethical influence. And I think that there are definite characteristics that define the difference between an ethical influencer or leader versus someone who is unethical. And so one of the things is lying, for example, that if someone says the weather was great during the inauguration, but everybody who was there got wet and the National Weather Service said it rained, but the person insists that the weather was fine, they're wrong. And therefore they're lying. And when there's a big lie and a loud lie and a repeated lie, the average person tends to defer and say, well, maybe I got it wrong, or maybe the weather service got it wrong, or maybe where he was, it wasn't rainy at all. But when there's a pattern of 91 or higher % of lies, the birther lie, for example, over and over and over, it becomes obvious that the person is an unethical leader. And there are other aspects like narcissism where people are not operating out of real relationships, but more compensatory relationship of wanting to look good in their mind. And so when they're accused of being abusive to women, making claims like nobody respects women more than me, or, I never said that I was grabbing a woman's genitalia, even though he was recorded, and the person who recorded him who was there heard it and stated it as fact. The characteristics of a cult leader is they want people to be loyal, they want people to be obedient, they want people to do whatever they're told, and they often will fire anybody who questions their judgment, questions their authority. There's very low toleration for dissension, which anyone who has studied group process or healthy institutions of democracy, it's a necessary ingredient to hold the big picture and to hear from different points of view and to be willing to say, I'm wrong, if there's a better way of thinking about something or if someone made a mistake. And when somebody can't admit that they were wrong or that they lied and apologize, that's another characteristic of cult leaders who think they're above the law, they think they're God on earth, and they expect everyone to just merge into what their definition of reality is.
And I was thinking, again, going back to the cult model, that different personalities are attracted to these organizations out of loneliness or social alienation, or even thinking about with Trump voters, a fear and anxiety of social change, a fear of the future, what we would call future shock. How does loneliness factor into why folks would join a political cult or another type of cult?
Well, I guess I have a little different take on it from my 41 years of activism. I think that, again, the fundamental attribution error, trying to find characteristics in people that makes them vulnerable to a totalist or totalitarian cult leader. I would say the piece that fits and resonates for me is that people who don't have a strong social network that can watch their back or say, hey, Chauncey, that person that you're, getting emotionally involved with has been lying and cheating and harming every other person they've been in a relationship with. Do your homework and find out more about their past. Good friends will watch out for each other and say, hey, there's danger. And if someone is isolated, often because of death of a loved one, maybe they graduated and moved to a new city, state, or country, they're going to be more vulnerable to undue influencers. I would look to things like sleep deprivation as a major factor that makes people more vulnerable to mind control. Information overload is another thing that will make people more vulnerable to undue influence. Confusion. If you want to mind control someone, confuse them. If you want to confuse them quickly, say an untruth as if it was a truth, or vice versa. Why are people vulnerable to this right now? I do agree that people are in an overload kind of shock, and the world is changing so very fast, and people feel out of control, and their historical values are being assaulted and challenged. And I would assert that multimedia, social media in particular, has an uncharacteristically large impact on people's psyches. In terms of your comment about or question about loneliness or feeling isolated or down, this notion of persona on social media, of posting pictures on Facebook or whatever, where lauding your accomplishments and not talking about all the bad things that are happening, it creates very unrealistic expectations about what is fulfilling life supposed to be about.
We have a lot of good empirical data about the paradox being that with the rise of social media, you would think that folks would feel more socially integrated, that they have better friendships, that they are less lonely. And it's actually exactly the opposite. And the folks that use social media, especially with millennials, are reporting remarkably high levels of loneliness and unhappiness. And you have that old joke about Facebook is like where people go to lie about how great their lives are. And we're in this challenging moment. Will it be Orwell or will it be Huxley? Will you control people through fear and intimidation, or will it be pleasure? and then you take away that pleasure and you can control them that way. But again, in your 4 decades, as I said, you'll certainly talk about your career and your life of doing this sort of work with mind control and with cults.
Right.
Would you have ever have expected the power that social media has over people?
No. I mean, I'm 63, and so the internet is a relatively, new invention. And when it started in the 90s, it was the greatest boon to helping fight Scientology and the Moonies and other major cults. Because, of course, part of mind control is information control, and intimidating critics and former members and hiding all the facts and all the documents is a key to keeping people controlled. And then people were putting up information left and right all over the world. And it was the great thing until the cults realized this isn't going away. And how do we manipulate search engines? How do we get Wikipedia to be manipulated? It keeps getting more and more advanced. And one huge difference from the 70s when I first started helping people to get out of destructive cults was when I was recruited, the recruiters needed to ask me questions about myself in order to figure out which buttons to push and how to recruit me. Whereas now with the social media, there's so much information that's accessible to people about others to be able to have even a formula for how to manipulate and control them. The United States as a society, the fact that we are not observing strict privacy protections over all the data that's being collected over our online behavior, unlike countries in Europe, it's really frightening because look at what China is doing. They have control over knowing what the activities, what purchases are made by every single citizen. And so they can have that much more totalitarian control over them.
Thinking about how power conditions individuals in the body to be obedient and compliant, again, going back to social media for a quick second, the research we know about people getting dopamine hits in their brains when they get a like on the internet, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then how cell phones are designed to maximize engagement. And you have folks who are literally addicted to technology, addicted to telephone. What does that pose for our future in terms of sort of thinking about community and the self when you have folks who are habitually conditioned to surrender, to conform?
It's frightening is what it is. And that's why I love to give talks, and I hope people read my book. And I appeal to former members of totalist cults to speak out about their experience, to try to sensitize more of the general public, because I do think it's a setup for a horrible future of mind control.
But what is the profile, the psychological profile of the cult leader? Or are there multiple profiles? Because sometimes it seems like folks just sort of fall into this, and they have a cult of personality, they're charismatic, and they gather a flock. And other times it seems like it's super, super intentional. Or again, is it a continuum where for some people it was an accident at first and they're con artists, and then they actually start to believe in it?
Good question. So it seems to me that there's a real difference between con artists and cult leaders, and that con artists want the money and they want to get out. They get a lot of it, but they don't want to stick around. Whereas cult leaders, they are addicted to power. They want fame. They want money. They want sex often. It's those three things: power, money, and sex. And what's interesting about those profiles is if you study some of the bigger cult groups and cult leaders, they were all in a cult themselves. And so for me, the paradigm of victim-victimizer seems to fit better than the con artist. If you think about people who molest children, such a high percentage were molested as children. In terms of the overarching number of people who are molested as children, a very small fraction become molesters. And I think a very small percentage of people who were raised in cults or were in cults start their own cult. But it's kind of a virus in that sense. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Essentially, prototypical cult leader is male, although there are a number of women. They have what we call insecure attachment to mother and father. In other words, they didn't feel safe. They didn't develop a healthy internalized sense of self. So their entire lives were functioning around compensating for that lack of sense of self by getting praise and kudos from the outside based on performance and doing things. In Trump's case, it's very interesting, but he was raised in the Church of Norman Vincent Peale, where doubting was evil. If you believe 100%, God will grant your blessings, and it was a very prosperity-oriented church, and where thought stopping was taught, which is one of the thought control techniques that I describe in my BITE model of mind control. So this very insecure kid who is taught dream big, think big, and somehow like fake it till you'll make it is one of the terms, and getting enough reinforcement that any information that contradicted this insecure sense of self, that source of information, was denigrated. In this case, Donald realizing, you know what, I'm not such hot shit. I'm not such a good person, and I'm not a reliable partner, and I'm not a good businessman after all. So the narcissism, the insecure attachment, this pathological lying, the grandiosity, the all or nothing, black and white, all us versus them thinking, this notion that they're infallible, trust him and everything's going to be okay, which appeals to a very childish part of everybody's psyche that wants to believe everything's going to be okay and that somehow Big Daddy is going to take care of us.
With Trump, though, you pointed out something, I mean, for a lot of folks, it would be a revelation about his religious upbringing, because, you know, a lot of folks are writing about why would evangelicals support this man when he's, quote unquote, so ungodly and he violates their own precepts and rules. You know, other folks are doing the superficial analysis saying, well, look, you know, maybe he'll change. I mean, the one I've liked is some of the writings saying that for evangelicals, Trump somehow, his emergence has something to do with the Antichrist, and that Trump is actually a good man. And this is, again, just a sign of the end times. You can go down the list with this sort of magical thinking. But I don't know how many folks know about Trump and his religious upbringing as a child, because I mean, that's new to me. And what can you just elaborate on, again, this thought stopping and the bite model? Because again, I think a lot of folks are going to sort of take a pause and be like, wow, maybe that's another missing piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding Donald Trump's personality.
Right. So in my book, Combating Cult Mind Control, I describe my model, which is based on Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory that says we have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And if you change any one, the other two will shift to reduce dissonance. I added information control, and I then created a laundry list of different variables of behavior control variables, information control variables, thought and emotional control variables. And I say the more a relationship or a group practices these four overlapping components, the more it fits the criteria of an unethical mind control cult. Now, in the case of the power of positive thinking, Norman Vincent Peale and his church, this was a prosperity church that more or less said, you know, believe 100% that God's going to give you this blessing and it's going to arrive. And if you doubt it, that's sin. That's Satan. And you have to block that negative thought. When I was in the Moon cult, I was trained to do thought stopping. Whenever anyone challenged that Moon was the Messiah or the divine principle wasn't, you know, the greatest teaching in human history, better than the Old and New Testament, any organizational policy, I immediately interpreted that as evil, satanic spirits, and I would chant or pray to get rid of the negative thought. And when you're in a mind control cult that says negative thoughts are not permissible, you're only allowed to have positive thoughts, what happens is you lose the ability to do any reality testing. So you're stuck with only conscious positive thoughts about the leader of the doctrine of the group, and you're burying systematically into your unconscious all the doubts and all the questions and all the hypocrisies and such. So when I'm working with people in religious cults, the reality is with thought stopping is you can't attack the leader of the doctrine of the group directly. So I always start with telling my story, explaining social psychology and things like the Ash Conformity Study and the Milgram Obedience Study and the Zimbardo Prison Study. And then maybe we'll talk about Jim Jones, or I'll talk about Heaven's Gate. I'll play some videos of the exit videos of people in Heaven's Gate who said, well, you may think that I'm in a cult and I'm brainwashed, but this decision is the wisest thing I've ever done. And when I show material about other groups, it sidesteps the thought stopping and it starts to build a bigger perspective to which if someone is in a religious cult, I say, do you believe in a God of truth or a God of lies? Or do you believe in Almighty God deliberately created Adam and Eve so that they had the potential to disobey? Or do you think Almighty God could have made them into robots that completely were obedient, blind followers? And if Almighty God didn't make Adam and Eve blind followers, why would you think God's doing that today? And I'm talking about Islam with ISIS or Boko Haram. I'm talking about Christian cults, Buddhist cults, Jewish cults, any group that has this black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil paradigm where, you know, critical thinking is suppressed or deliberately undermined, where phobia programming, which is a big part of emotional control, the deliberate implantation of irrational fears, that terrible things are going to happen to you if you question the leader or don't act in an obedient way. And in my book, Freedom of Mind, I have a chapter on phobias, and I have 4 pages single-spaced of the most common phobias that I've encountered in my practice over decades. So if you leave, you're going to go insane. If you leave, you're going to get hit by a car. If you leave, you're going to get cancer. Your loved ones will blow up. You'll lose your spiritual life. You'll rot in hell for eternity, on and on and on. I find psychoeducation, by teaching people about psychology, encouraging them to activate their own inner voice, their own inner conscience, their own values, and what they think is important. People deep down inside don't want to be lied to and don't want to be tricked and harmed and don't want to be cut off from family and friends and want the freedom to think and exercise their own volition.
How often is it that you have the person who discovers they have a talent, right? Then they can compel others, and then they start the cult. It could be a small cult, it could be a huge one that grows. And behind the scenes, are they sitting there with the other folks who are leading the cult and sort of laughing at the rubes, saying, ha, 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 we got them, we got their money, we can control them? Or at a certain point, thinking about the con artist, right? So Trump is clearly a con artist. He didn't want to win, we know that. And then he gets in on it, and then he starts to believe his own narrative because now he can see even how much more money he can make. But he's probably at this point perhaps convinced himself he's a true believer and that he really is this sort of political messianic figure. So in private with these cult leaders, how many of them are just, as we said, hucksters who got the angle going and they're laughing in private, but they put on the performance in public, like you would see with these televangelists? And what percentage of them, more often than not, perhaps really believe this stuff and they just say, oh, the money and the power and the sex, that's just divine power and it's coming to me because I'm deserving?
My strong opinion is that people are influenced into a reality where that it's self-confirming because they surround themselves with yes people. And they actually come to believe their own stuff. They lack the ability to reality test. I remember L. Ron Hubbard being quoted as saying, if you guys want to write for a penny a word, meaning science fiction writers, go ahead. But if you ask me how to make $1 million, you should start a religion. That's one of the more famous quotes. But he was in a cult of Aleister Crowley. His highest belief was do what thou wilt. And it was a very power-oriented, you are God and you create your own reality mentality. And again, I think Hubbard really didn't live an enjoyable, fulfilled life. I think he was a miserable person who was trapped by his own creation.
How do you think the popular culture has misrepresented either your personal experience or the experience of other folks like yourself? Because, of course, you mentioned, I was thinking of the movie The Master, or thinking about, these after-school specials. I remember watching these in high school. The sad young woman or young boy who's alienated from their friends, and then a white van shows up, or they get in with a new crowd, and they kidnap them, and they brainwash them, and then you have to send the A-team to rescue these young people. I remember that A-team episode very fondly.
I think these stories are told largely by people who were never in a cult. So it's more caricature based on superficialities. But I would say in recent years, more former members are getting in on writing scripts. And so it's getting more closer to reality and the truth. The bottom line is that there are political cults, therapy cults, religious cults, large group awareness training cults, multi-level marketing cults. There are one-on-one cults. And so what I want to say to the public is there are these patterns, and look for this influence continuum that I have on my website, Freedom of Mind, and look at the BITE model and use that as parameters before you go away to some isolated retreat or fall in love with someone and start sharing your deepest, darkest fears and dreams. And just know that if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. And that if something is legitimate, they won't be telling you, don't tell your parents or don't tell anybody that we're talking, because that's how ISIS likes to recruit, because people won't understand. And they'll use metaphors or movies like The Matrix and try to flip. You may think you know what reality is, but there's something completely different going on. Do you really want to be in on the truth?
Or Dark City. It was remarkably popular among white supremacists.
Yes. So coming back to what we now have learned about the human imagination and what we've learned about the human mind and how easy it is for humans to learn and get programmed, as you were correctly referring to the dopamine hits and the deliberate creation of people with technology platforms and video games to make people addicted with their attention, it becomes increasingly important for people to step back and realize life is more than virtual. And that real friends are people that you spend time with in reality and not texting where you're sitting in the sofa next to them, but where you're looking into each other's eyes and connecting with them. And on that point, I'll comment that I've worked with a number of people who are on Asperger's and are on the autistic spectrum. I read a book called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, who talked about how Silicon Valley is filled with people who are on the spectrum.
He was on 60 Minutes talking about that, correct?
Yes, he was. Essentially, what's happening is people on the spectrum are far more comfortable interacting with computer screens than human beings. And to a certain extent, they're creating all of these platforms and all these games because that's what they're comfortable with. And us, quote, neurotypicals, unquote, are now getting programmed to be more like them as opposed to having real intimacy. There's a great series in the New York Times about online porn and its impact on adolescence, where young people are getting these caricatured versions of intimacy and sexual satisfaction that makes them addicts and makes them impossible for them to have really gratifying, in reality, sexual relationships.
And video games are a huge part about this also because thinking about what a video game is, it's a self-validating experience machine. It's an alternate reality character. You get immediate rewards. You keep trying to solve the puzzles and you get a dopamine hit when you get it.
So B.J. Hoff was one of the originators of realization of this programming function over at Stanford Lab. Tristan Harris, I've heard his talks about, as a former Google ethicist, about just how dangerous the virtual reality is becoming. And I might add, whatever we learn that has the power to help has the power to harm. Ethically, as we're developing technology, we need to think as we're constructing these new technologies, not just the benefits, but also the harms, and find ways to steer a middle course where it's not priming people to be mindless cult members.
This may sound like a tangential question, but I think it's right at the heart of what we're talking about in terms of all these other integrated systems of thought control, of mind control, of influencing. I'm thinking obviously of Eddie Bernays, the Freudian who was the father of modern marketing and advertising. Is consumerism a type of mind control? I mean, for some people it would sound extreme, but for my political orientation and my understanding, I used to work in marketing, that folks are conditioned, number one, to believe democracy and capitalism are the same thing. Advertising is teaching people to find needs they don't already have.
You hit on one of the most important figures. There was a documentary series called The Century of the Self that talked about Edward Bernays in particular. He was the person that was hired to teach women to smoke cigarettes. He was the first person who was hired to do a presidential election in order to influence people how to vote. And to a certain extent, the Cold War of the 40s, the 50s, the whole term brainwashing was coined by Edward Hunter in the 50s. And there was a whole mind control race with MK-Ultra, which was part of the CIA's research program of how to build a Manchurian candidate and such. And all of that knowledge and information is, I believe, used very systematically to sell products, as you correctly said, to create a need where they didn't exist before. Again, there's more to life than fame, glory, status, and buying a car because you've seen a commercial X number of times with a beautiful blonde on the hood. There needs to be more to a decision to spend large amounts of money on a sports car than that.
When we sit down and think about, this cult of personality around Trump, how would you try to convince his supporters or other folks who have been in cults? How would you deprogram them? How would you sit down and actually sit across from them and say, here's what's happened to you, and here's how you can see a better version of reality, or return to a better self, a healthy self?
But what you don't want to do is call them names or say they're stupid or they're closed-minded or cut off contact and no longer be their friends. If you want to influence someone who's been unduly influenced, you need contact with them. And you want to build rapport and trust and focus on areas that you can agree on. You want to open yourself up to saying, teach me, share with me why I should change my beliefs to be more like yours. And when the person starts telling you their point of view, then you say, may I try something on you? I want to get your feedback and share another point of view. Going on from there, aside from rapport and trust building and asking good questions and giving a long silence when you ask a good question, I have specific what I call freedom of mind techniques. And the big one is that when you're in a cult, a mind control cult, you don't believe you are, but you'll be very fast to agree other groups are mind control cults. And so you find out from them what would be a mind control cult. Would North Korea be an example of a mind control cult? And then we get into the BITE model and behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control elements. Once you build a case example that the person agrees with, then you start filling it out with other case examples. And you want to get to the point where you say, look, if someone's legitimate, they'll stand up to scrutiny. if something is true. And would you want to follow someone that you can't trust who will betray you? And people say, oh no, I would never want to be with someone that's going to betray me. So you basically are walking people through a psychoeducational set of experiences based on you respecting them, being thoughtful, kind, listening with them, sharing things that in commonality, and letting them tell you what else needs to happen for them to wake up or to consider talking to ex-believers, who are always demonized, by the way, in mind control cults, and finding out more about who they were before they got into the cult and appealing to those sets of values.
And I must imagine you have so many stories to share and sort of a leading question, but given the subjects you write about and the type of work you do and the organizations you've stood up against in terms of trying to help folks who are ex-cult members, have you received a lot of threats?
Of course, I've been threatened, sued, followed. My garbage has been gone through. I've had complaints against I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I've had 4 different frivolous complaints filed by enemies. Fortunately, the worst that's happened in 41 years is I was punched in the face and my glasses were broken by a Moonie on orders. But fortunately, nothing more serious than that has happened. And like I said, I've been sued and followed and threatened. But I try to stay high profile, and I have like 100 free videos on. I've been on many, many TV shows, 60 Minutes, Nightline, Dateline, Today Show, Oprah Winfrey, whatever. Anyone who takes the time to listen to me, they realize I'm talking about a theme here. It's my life is not just against Scientology or just isn't against the Moonies. I'm against destructive undue influence and mind control. And I believe in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I believe in the respect and integrity of a human individual to make their own decisions.
In terms of thinking about this moment or in general, what gives you hope for the future and what are you afraid about?
Well, what gives me hope is that we still have people who have the courage to stand up against bullies and against totalitarians. We have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Center for Investigative Journalism and Salon.com and so Politico and so many other information that isn't propaganda, but information that's based on facts and fact-checking and reality and responsibility. That's so important, and that gives me hope. I have a 15-year-old son, and I talk with a lot of young people who are very upset and are activists, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I have a large number of former cult members who've lived under totalism and totalitarianism and are not being silent either. Leah Remini has an Emmy Award-winning TV show against Scientology. That gives me a lot of hope. And what frightens me is that the most powerful position on earth, the President of the United States, could unilaterally declare a war and then declare martial law. And whether or not he can get away with it, or whether or not he can avoid being subpoenaed and answer the questions of Bob Mueller, that's the pivotal moment for me. Because I agree with many of the people that I've heard discuss the inquiry that's pending. And they say Trump can't tell the truth for a half an hour, much less with all the documentation, all the interviews that have been done. And so perjury is the inevitability of Bob Mueller's inquiry. But the question is, how will that happen? Will that happen? I'm hoping that Republican leadership will wake up and realize that the future of and the soul of America is at stake here.
Powerful words. So where can folks find you online? Your books, speaking engagements, videos, and the like?
So freedomofmind.com is my website. I'm also in a doctoral program, and I have a nonprofit division called the freedomfromundueinfluence.org. And I have all kinds of social media linked to that if you get to my website, you can find that. I have Combating Cult Mind Control, which is going to have its 30th anniversary in November of this 2018. And my book, Freedom of Mind, Helping Loved Ones Leave Controlling People, Cults, and Beliefs.
I want to thank Stephen Hassan one more time for that great teaching and sharing. You know, I got to disagree with one thing. He's more hopeful than I am. He may have had 40 years deprogramming people, getting people out of cults, helping families and individuals. But I don't